Good God. The retired four-star general pushed back his chair so abruptly that every conversation in the ballroom stopped. His eyes were locked on the faded Navy watch on my wrist. "Where did you get that?" he asked. I glanced around the room. Nearly 200 people had gone silent. Bank presidents, judges, developers, politicians, the wealthiest people in Charleston. My husband looked annoyed. The general took another step toward me. "Ma'am," he said, his voice suddenly unsteady. "That watch, where did you get it?" I swallowed. "It belonged to my father." "What was his name?" I hesitated. Then I answered, "Captain Michael Whitaker." The color drained from the general's face. For a moment he looked 20 years older. Then he shot to his feet. "Captain Whitaker's daughter." The room became so quiet I could hear glasses being set down. My husband stared at the general as if he'd lost his mind. The general looked at me, then at Richard, then back at me. And that's when he said the words that changed everything. "Good God." He shook his head slowly. "He has no idea who you are." That moment became the talk of Charleston for months. But to understand why it happened, you have to understand who I was before that night, and who my husband believed I was. My name is Sarah Whitaker. I'm 58 years old, retired from the United States Navy, and for most of my life I was perfectly comfortable being overlooked. I grew up in military housing, the kind with thin walls and squeaky floors, the kind where every family on the block knew what deployment felt like. My father served in the Navy for nearly 3 decades. My grandfather had served before him. Military service wasn't something extraordinary in our family. It was simply what people did. My father used to say something that stayed with me my entire life. Character is what remains when nobody is watching. He believed it, lived it, expected it. We weren't rich, not even close. My mother clipped coupons. We drove used cars. Vacations usually meant visiting relatives instead of resorts. But I never felt deprived. Because in our home, respect mattered more than money. Duty mattered more than recognition. And integrity mattered more than appearances. Those lessons eventually carried me into the Navy myself. I served for over 25 years, most of it quietly. I wasn't a hero. I wasn't famous. I simply did my job. When I retired as a commander, I felt proud of my career and grateful for the people I'd served alongside. A few years later, I met Richard. At first, he seemed charming, confident, successful. He owned a thriving real estate development company in Charleston. He could walk into any room and immediately become the center of attention. People liked him. Investors trusted him. And after years of military life, I found his confidence refreshing. We married when I was 46. For a while, things were good. Or at least I thought they were. Looking back, I can see signs I ignored. Small comments, subtle dismissals, tiny moments that seemed harmless at the time. Richard measured success differently than I did. To him, accomplishments had dollar signs attached. The size of your house, the make of your car, the club you belonged to, the people who returned your phone calls. I didn't think much of it initially. Everyone has different priorities. But over the years, those differences became harder to ignore, especially when it came to my family. Richard never openly insulted them. Not at first. He simply dismissed them. Whenever conversations turned toward family histories, he'd happily discuss wealthy entrepreneurs, local business leaders, and prominent Charleston families. When my family came up, his interest vanished. One evening years earlier, he had looked through an old photo album. Pictures of my father, my grandfather, military ceremonies, ships, deployments, uniforms. He closed the album. "Interesting," he said. That was it. Interesting. As though decades of service could be summarized in a single word. I remember feeling disappointed. Not angry, just disappointed. Still, I let it go. I always let things go. Perhaps that's one of my flaws. My father believed dignity often meant remaining silent. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes it isn't. The charity gala took place in early spring, one of Charleston's largest annual fundraising events. Black ties, formal gowns, crystal chandeliers, expensive wine, the kind of evening Richard loved. He spent weeks preparing, choosing suits, meeting donors, planning conversations. I attended because I was his wife, nothing more. The ballroom overlooked the harbor. As the sun disappeared beyond the water, the room filled with laughter and networking. Richard moved effortlessly among the guests. I followed along politely, shaking hands, making conversation, listening more than speaking. At one point, we joined a table filled with local business leaders, a banker, a state judge, several prominent donors. One woman smiled warmly. "So Sarah, tell us about your family. A simple question. The kind people ask every day." Before I could answer, Richard laughed. Not a cruel laugh. Not yet. Just an amused one. "Oh, her family." He took a sip of wine. "They're military people." The table nodded politely. Richard shrugged. "A family of nobodies, really." Several guests chuckled awkwardly. One man smiled. Another looked uncomfortable. Nobody challenged him. Nobody knew what to say. And for a moment, neither did I. The words weren't loud. They weren't dramatic. But they landed harder than he realized. A family of nobodies. I thought about my grandfather crossing the Pacific during World War II. I thought about my father spending months at sea. I thought about military funerals, folded flags, sacrifices, long absences, missed birthdays, years of service. A family of nobodies. I felt something tighten inside my chest. Not anger. Not exactly. More like sadness. The kind that comes when someone you love reveals a truth about themselves. A truth you've been avoiding for years. I looked down at my wrist. My father's old Navy watch rested beneath the cuff of my dress sleeve. The metal was worn smooth from decades of use. I still wore it on special occasions. Not because it was valuable. Because it reminded me who I came from. And who I wanted to be. I could have corrected Richard. Could have argued. Could have listed accomplishments. Ranks. Awards. History. Instead, I remembered my father's voice. Never chase validation. So I stayed quiet. The conversation moved on. The guests forgot about the comment. Or so I thought. Across the ballroom, an elderly gentleman had stopped walking. He was staring directly at my wrist. His expression had completely changed. At first, I didn't recognize him. Then realization struck. The man wasn't just another guest. He was General Thomas Bradley, one of the most respected military leaders of his generation, and he was walking straight toward me, slowly, deliberately, without taking his eyes off my father's watch. The closer he came, the more serious his expression became, and suddenly I knew something extraordinary was about to happen. General Thomas Bradley stopped beside our table. The room didn't notice him at first. Most people were busy talking, sipping wine, or discussing business deals. But I noticed, and so did Richard. The general wasn't looking at anyone else. His eyes remained fixed on the old Navy watch resting on my wrist. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said. His voice carried the calm authority of a man who had spent decades commanding troops. "May I ask you something?" I stood politely. "Of course, General." He pointed gently toward the watch. "Where did you get that?" I glanced down. The watch looked ordinary. The stainless steel case was scratched. The leather band had been replaced years ago. Nothing about it suggested importance. "It belonged to my father," I said. The general's expression tightened. "Your father?" "Yes, sir." The table had grown quiet. Nearby guests were beginning to pay attention. General Bradley stepped closer. What was his name? Something about his tone made my heart beat faster. I wasn't sure why. Captain Michael Whitaker. For a second, the general simply stared at me. Then all color seemed to leave his face. His eyes widened. The reaction was so sudden that several people noticed immediately. Even Richard looked confused. The general whispered something under his breath. Then he stood completely upright. "Captain Whitaker's daughter." I nodded. "Yes, sir." His hands trembled slightly. Not from age, from emotion. The room around us continued growing quieter. Conversations faded. People sensed something important was happening. General Bradley took a slow breath. Then, to my complete surprise, he extended his hand. Not casually. Respectfully. Almost formally. I shook it. He looked directly into my eyes. I haven't heard that name spoken in nearly 20 years. I didn't know what to say. My father had been gone for almost a decade. Outside military circles, few people remembered him. Richard glanced between us. "I'm sorry," he interrupted politely. "Do you know Sarah's father?" The general turned toward him. The expression on his face changed instantly. Not hostile. Not angry. Simply astonished. "Know him." He looked back at me. Then back at Richard. "My son, some men spend an entire lifetime hoping to possess half the courage Michael Whitaker had." The table fell silent. Every single person was listening now. Richard forced a smile. "I'm sure he was a fine officer." The general's eyebrows lifted. "A fine officer?" He almost laughed. "No," he shook his head. "Captain Whitaker was far more than that." Someone nearby pulled out a chair for the general. Instead of sitting, he remained standing, as though the memory itself demanded respect. Guests from nearby tables had begun drifting closer. Nobody wanted to miss whatever story was unfolding. General Bradley looked at me. "Did your father ever tell you about the North Atlantic incident?" I frowned. "No, sir." A faint smile crossed his face. Of course he didn't. That sounded exactly like my father. He never spoke about his accomplishments. Never. As a child, I often learned more about his career from other sailors than from him. The general folded his hands. Most of it remained classified for years. Now people were openly gathering around us. The ballroom had become unusually quiet. Even the live music seemed distant. The general continued. 40 years ago during the Cold War, your father's ship encountered a crisis in the North Atlantic. He paused. I can't discuss every detail even now, but I can tell you this. His voice softened. There were young sailors aboard who should not have survived that night. I listened carefully. I'd never heard this story. Not once. The general looked toward the harbor visible through the ballroom windows, as if seeing another time. Conditions were terrible, equipment failures, dangerous seas, a chain of events nobody expected. He returned his gaze to me. Your father refused to abandon his people. I felt a lump form in my throat. The general continued. He stayed where the danger was greatest. The room remained completely silent. He personally led rescue efforts for hours. Someone nearby whispered, "My God." The general nodded. Several men later credited him with saving their lives. I stared at him. Why didn't he ever tell us? The general smiled sadly. Because men like your father rarely do. That answer felt painfully familiar. My father never talked about medals. Never discussed recognition. Whenever someone praised him, he changed the subject. Growing up, I thought all military families were like that. Only later did I realize how unusual he truly was. Richard shifted uncomfortably. For the first time that evening, he looked uncertain. The confidence he normally carried seemed to be fading. The general noticed. Everyone noticed. And then came the moment that changed the entire atmosphere of the room. A wealthy donor standing nearby asked a question. If Captain Whitaker was so respected, why haven't we heard of him? The general smiled. Because he spent his life avoiding attention. A few people nodded. The donor looked surprised. But surely he received awards. Oh, he did. The general chuckled softly. Many of them. Then he looked directly at me. I assume he never displayed them. I laughed despite myself. No, sir. Of course not. The general shook his head. That's exactly what I expected. The crowd laughed gently. For the first time all evening, I felt warmth instead of embarrassment. Not because of the attention. Because someone understood my father. Truly understood him. The general's voice became more serious. Do you know why people respected Michael Whitaker? I shook my head. He answered immediately. Because he never cared about recognition. His eyes swept across the ballroom. Across the expensive suits, the designer dresses, the luxury watches, the symbols of success. He cared about people. Nobody spoke. The message hung in the air. I saw several veterans in attendance nod quietly. They understood. Maybe better than anyone. The general looked toward Richard. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then he asked a simple question. Sir, how long have you been married? Richard blinked. 12 years. 12 years. The general repeated the words slowly. Then he looked genuinely stunned. 12 years and you never learned who her father was. A few people shifted awkwardly. Richard's face reddened. I knew he served in the Navy. The general stared at him. Then at me. Finally, he shook his head. That's when he spoke the words everyone would later repeat across Charleston. Words that would spread through country clubs, veteran halls, and dinner tables for months. Good God. His voice was barely above a whisper. He has no idea who you are. The room froze. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I felt every eye turned toward me. For the first time all evening, Richard looked genuinely shaken. And deep inside, I realized something important. This wasn't about my father's reputation. It wasn't about military honors. It wasn't even about the watch. It was about respect. For 12 years, my husband had never truly tried to understand where I came from. And now, in front of the entire city elite, that truth was becoming impossible to ignore. As the general prepared to tell the rest of the story, I saw something in Richard's eyes I had never seen before. Fear. For several seconds after General Bradley spoke those words, nobody in the ballroom said anything. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was thoughtful. The kind of silence that settles over a room when people suddenly realize they've misunderstood something important. I glanced at Richard. His expression had changed completely. The confident smile he had worn all evening was gone. For perhaps the first time since I'd met him, he looked uncertain. General Bradley remained standing beside me. The old soldier seemed less interested in impressing anyone than in correcting a misunderstanding. And that misunderstanding wasn't about my father. It was about what makes a life meaningful. A woman standing near the front finally broke the silence. General Bradley, she asked gently, was Captain Whitaker really that respected? The general smiled. Then he gave an answer I'll never forget. No, several people looked confused. Then he continued. He was more respected than most people in this room can imagine. A few quiet laughs rippled through the crowd. Not mocking laughs. Nervous ones. The general turned toward me. Sarah, your father would probably be furious with me right now. That made me laugh. You're probably right. The crowd laughed with us. Because Michael hated attention. The general shook his head. Absolutely hated it. He looked around the room. I spent years trying to convince him to accept public recognition. What happened? Someone asked. He always found a reason to avoid it. More laughter. The general pointed at me. Looks like his daughter inherited that habit. I smiled. That much was true. As the crowd settled in, General Bradley began sharing stories. Not classified stories. Not dramatic movie scenes. Just moments that revealed character. The kind of stories military people tell about those they admire. There was a young sailor once, the general said. He made a serious mistake during a deployment. The general folded his hands behind his back. The sort of mistake that could have ended a career. Several veterans in the room nodded knowingly. The military can be unforgiving. The general continued. Most officers would have protected themselves. He looked toward me. Your father protected the sailor instead. A man nearby frowned. He took the blame. In a way, the general nodded. He accepted responsibility because he believed leaders own failures before they claim successes. I felt my throat tighten. That sounded exactly like my father. Exactly. The general smiled. The young sailor stayed in the Navy. What happened to him? A woman asked. The general's smile widened. He eventually became an admiral. The room erupted in surprised laughter. You're kidding. No, the general chuckled. That admiral still tells the story. I found myself looking down at my father's watch. For years after his death, I'd worried that people would forget him. Not because he needed recognition, because he had mattered. Now I was learning how many lives he had quietly touched. One story led to another, and another. The ballroom had transformed from a charity gala into something closer to a reunion. Veterans approached. Retired officers. Former service members. People I'd never met. Several recognized my father's name immediately. One elderly Marine shook my hand. I served alongside your father once. His eyes glistened. Best officer I ever met. A retired Navy chief nodded. Same here. Another veteran smiled. Your grandfather wasn't bad either. That surprised me. You knew my grandfather. Everybody knew your grandfather. The man laughed. I couldn't help smiling. My grandfather had served in World War II. Growing up, he rarely discussed combat. Most of his stories involved fellow sailors, practical jokes, or life lessons. Only after his death did we discover the extent of his military record. The medals, the commendations, the citations. Even then, my family kept most of it private. That's simply how we were raised. As conversations continued, memories began flooding back. I found myself drifting into childhood, back to a small Navy house in Norfolk, back to evenings around the kitchen table, back to lessons I didn't fully appreciate until adulthood. My father never preached. He taught through example. Every Saturday morning he volunteered somewhere, sometimes veterans groups, sometimes community projects, sometimes helping neighbors. When I was young, I assumed everyone did those things. Later, I realized many people didn't. One summer afternoon, I asked him why he spent so much time helping strangers. His answer stayed with me. Because someday you'll need help too. That was it. No speech. No lecture. Just simple wisdom. The kind that grows more meaningful with age. Meanwhile, Richard remained unusually quiet. I could almost see the gears turning in his mind. For years, he'd judged my family according to standards that made sense in his world. Net worth, influence, connections, status. Now those measurements suddenly seemed inadequate. People weren't gathering around me because my family had been wealthy. They weren't impressed by business success. They were responding to something deeper. Character, service, legacy, values. Things money couldn't purchase. And Richard was beginning to realize it. Eventually, a wealthy businessman approached our group. I'd seen him at previous charity events, the sort of man whose name appeared regularly in local newspapers. He looked at me thoughtfully. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." He gestured toward the growing crowd. "Why didn't you ever tell people about any of this?" The question seemed to fascinate everyone. Several people leaned closer. "Waiting?" I thought carefully before answering. Then I smiled. "Because my father taught me that service isn't something you brag about." The room fell quiet again. Not because my answer was profound, because it was simple, and sometimes simple truths land the hardest. The businessman nodded slowly. "I think that's something we've forgotten." Several people murmured in agreement. Even Richard. A few minutes later, General Bradley approached me once more. His expression had grown thoughtful, almost emotional. "There's something else you should know." "What is it?" He looked around the room, then lowered his voice slightly. "Your father and grandfather didn't just serve." I frowned. "What do you mean?" The general smiled. "Have you ever wondered where the Whitaker Scholarship Fund came from?" I blinked. Of course I knew the scholarship fund. It provided financial assistance to military widows and children. My family had supported it for years, but I'd always assumed it was created by a larger organization. The general shook his head. "Your grandfather started it." My eyes widened. "What?" "Your father expanded it." I stared at him. "Nobody ever told me that." They didn't want credit. The answer came immediately. Of course it did. That was exactly what my family would do. The general smiled sadly. 3 generations of your family spent their lives helping people without asking for recognition. He glanced toward Richard, then back to me. That's a rare thing these days. For the first time all evening, I saw genuine shame appear on my husband's face. Not embarrassment, not discomfort. Something deeper. The painful realization that he'd spent years misunderstanding the people who had shaped the woman he married. And as I looked into his eyes, I began wondering whether our marriage had been built on something missing from the very beginning. Respect. That question followed me for the rest of the evening, and before the night was over, it would become impossible to ignore. The gala ended shortly before midnight. By then, the story had spread through nearly every corner of the ballroom. People who had barely noticed me at the beginning of the evening were stopping to shake my hand on their way out. Veterans thanked me for my family's service. Several people shared stories about parents, siblings, or children who had served in the military. One woman hugged me unexpectedly. "My husband was Navy," she said softly. "He passed away 3 years ago." I squeezed her hand. No long speech was necessary. Some experiences don't require explanation. We simply understand one another. The ride home was unusually quiet. Richard drove. I looked out the passenger side window. Charleston's historic streets were nearly empty. Streetlights reflected across old brick buildings. The harbor breeze moved gently through the palms. Normally, Richard loved discussing social events after they ended. Who attended? Who donated? Who made important connections? Tonight he said almost nothing. Neither did I. The silence stretched for nearly 20 minutes. Finally he spoke. I had no idea. His voice sounded smaller than usual. I kept looking out the window. "No." "You should have told me." I turned toward him. For a moment I simply stared. Then I asked the question that had been sitting in my heart for years. Would it have mattered? Richard didn't answer immediately. And that silence told me everything. The next morning I woke early. Old Navy habits die hard. Coffee at 6. Local newspaper. Quiet reflection before the world starts moving. Richard was already awake. That surprised me. Normally he slept later on weekends. Instead he sat at the kitchen table staring into a cup of coffee. His expression looked troubled. Not tired. Troubled. I poured myself a cup and sat across from him. Neither of us spoke. Eventually he sighed. "I embarrassed myself." I nodded. "Yes." He looked down. "I didn't mean it the way it sounded." I considered that. Then answered honestly. "Richard, that's exactly how you meant it." His eyes lifted. I continued. "You just didn't expect anyone to challenge it." The truth hung between us. Neither pleasant nor cruel. Simply true. Over the next few days, something unusual happened. People started talking. Charleston is a beautiful city. It's also a small city in many ways. News travels fast, especially among social circles. By Monday afternoon, Richard had received multiple phone calls. Some were supportive. Others weren't. A retired judge who had attended the gala called him directly. A longtime business associate made a pointed comment during lunch. Several veterans involved with local charities expressed disappointment. Nobody attacked him. Nobody publicly humiliated him. That wasn't the culture of the people involved. Instead, they did something far more uncomfortable. They held him accountable. Quietly, respectfully, firmly. And Richard wasn't used to that. A week later, I overheard part of a phone conversation in his office. The door wasn't completely closed. I wasn't eavesdropping. His voice simply carried down the hallway. "What do you mean they're reconsidering?" Pause. "No, that's ridiculous." Longer pause. I heard frustration entering his voice. "Because of one comment." Another pause. Then silence. A few moments later, he ended the call. When he emerged, he looked angry. Not at me, at the situation. "What happened?" I asked. He rubbed his forehead. "Nothing." I waited. Eventually, he sighed. "A veterans organization withdrew support from one of our projects." I nodded slowly. "I see." "They said my comments raised concerns about leadership." I looked at him carefully. "And what do you think?" His jaw tightened. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he walked away. Glad. As the weeks passed, the consequences continued. Nothing dramatic. No public scandal. No ruined career. This wasn't that kind of story. Instead, Richard experienced something unfamiliar. People began seeing him differently. Not because of a mistake, because of what the mistake revealed. Character matters, especially to older Americans, especially to veterans, especially to people who spent their lives valuing service over status. Richard was discovering that lesson firsthand, and he hated it, at first. One evening, about 3 weeks after the gala, we attended a charity board meeting. Several people greeted me warmly. One retired colonel shook my hand. Another volunteer asked about my father. The interactions were friendly, natural, nothing excessive. Yet I noticed something. Richard noticed it too. The respect people showed me had nothing to do with wealth. Nothing to do with social standing. Nothing to do with influence. It came from values, from service, from reputation. And for perhaps the first time in his life, Richard realized those things couldn't be purchased. That night after we returned home, the conversation we'd both been avoiding finally happened. We sat on the back porch overlooking our yard. The spring air felt cool. Crickets chirped in the distance. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then I broke the silence. "Why did you say it?" Richard stared into the darkness. "What? You know what?" His shoulders sagged. For once, he didn't pretend, didn't deflect, didn't joke, because I believed it. The honesty surprised me. I appreciated it anyway. He continued. "I grew up thinking success meant money." His voice sounded tired. "My father worked 3 jobs." I listened quietly. "We were always one emergency away from disaster." His eyes remained fixed on the yard. "When people have money, they're safe." I nodded. "I understand." "No." He shook his head. "You understand better than I do." That statement carried more truth than he realized. Military families understand uncertainty. Deployments, transfers, risk, loss. Nothing is guaranteed. Richard took a deep breath. "I spent my entire life chasing security." He laughed bitterly. Somewhere along the way, I started confusing money with value. The words settled heavily between us. I thought about that. Then I asked softly, "And my family?" His face tightened. I judged them. Why? Because they didn't fit the world I understood. For the first time, I saw genuine vulnerability. Not embarrassment. Not pride. Vulnerability. The kind that appears when someone stops defending themselves. I looked toward the stars above our yard, then back at him. "My father spent months away from home." Richard nodded. "I know." "He missed birthdays." Another nod. "Anniversaries." "Yes." "Holidays." His eyes dropped. I continued. "And he'd do it all again." The porch fell silent. Finally, I spoke the words that had been building inside me since the gala. "You didn't insult my father." Richard looked up. "He isn't here anymore." I felt emotion tightening my chest. "You insulted every family that sacrificed alongside him." The words landed hard. I could see it. For several seconds, Richard simply sat there, motionless. Then his eyes filled with tears. Not dramatic tears. Not movie tears. The kind older people recognize. The kind that come from regret. Real regret. When he finally spoke, his voice barely rose above a whisper. "I don't know how to fix this." I looked at him carefully, and for the first time in weeks I answered honestly. "I don't know either." The admission hurt, because it was true. 12 years of marriage doesn't unravel overnight. Neither does trust. Neither does respect. Both are built slowly. And both can be damaged slowly too. Richard lowered his head. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely afraid. Not afraid of losing business. Not afraid of public embarrassment. Afraid of losing me. And as I sat there beneath the Charleston night sky, I quietly admitted something to myself. For the first time in our marriage, I wasn't sure whether staying was the right choice. For nearly 2 weeks after our conversation on the porch, Richard changed. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. There was no grand speech. No desperate promises. No dramatic attempts to save our marriage. At my age, I've learned to be cautious around words. Words are easy. Change is hard. And real change takes time. What caught my attention wasn't what Richard said. It was what he started doing. One Saturday morning, I came downstairs expecting to find him watching financial news. Instead, he was sitting at the kitchen table reading something. Several sheets of paper lay spread before him. Old documents. Copies of military records. Photographs. Letters. I recognized them immediately. They had belonged to my father. Richard looked up. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly asked, "Did your father really write all these letters during deployments?" I nodded. Every week. He looked down again. The pages seemed fragile in his large hands. I had no idea. There was that phrase again. I had no idea. For years, those words might have irritated me. Now they sounded different. Now they sounded like the beginning of understanding. Over the next several weeks, Richard kept asking questions. Questions he should have asked years earlier. Questions most husbands ask when they genuinely want to know their wives. What was deployment like? How often did my father come home? How did my mother handle the absences? What was it like growing up in military housing? Why had I chosen the Navy? What did service mean to me? At first I answered cautiously. A part of me wondered whether this was temporary, whether guilt was driving his curiosity. But the questions kept coming, and they felt sincere. One evening he surprised me. I called General Bradley. I nearly dropped my coffee cup. "You what?" Richard smiled awkwardly. He invited me to lunch. I stared. The same general who had unintentionally exposed him in front of Charleston's elite. "Why?" Richard laughed softly. "Because I told him I needed an education." For the first time in weeks, I found myself smiling. Lunch turned into 3 hours, then another meeting, then another. General Bradley became something of an unexpected mentor. Not because Richard wanted military connections, because he wanted perspective. One afternoon after returning home, Richard sat beside me on the couch. The expression on his face looked thoughtful. "Do you know what the general told me today?" "What?" Richard shook his head slowly. "He said your father never cared who got credit." I smiled. "That's true." He said most people spend their lives trying to be important. I nodded. "And the people who actually matter rarely talk about themselves." The room grew quiet. Richard stared toward the window. "I've spent my whole life doing the opposite." There was no self-pity in his voice, just honesty. And honesty is where growth begins. A month later, Richard asked me a question I never expected. "Would you take me somewhere where?" He hesitated, then answered softly, "Arlington." For several seconds, I simply looked at him. My father wasn't buried there, but many people he served with were. Many members of our extended military family rested there. Arlington National Cemetery is sacred ground to anyone who has worn the uniform. I had visited several times. Richard never had. 2 weeks later, we flew to Washington. The morning was cool and overcast. The cemetery stretched before us in perfect rows of white headstones. Orderly, quiet, endless. No matter how many times you visit Arlington, it affects you. The sight humbles you, reminds you how many people carried burdens most Americans never see. Richard walked silently beside me. For nearly an hour, he barely spoke. We passed families visiting loved ones, veterans standing quietly, children asking questions, flags moving gently in the breeze. Eventually, Richard stopped. He stared across hundreds of white markers, his eyes filled with emotion. "I've never seen anything like this." I nodded. "Most people haven't." He swallowed hard. "So many." "Yes, so many sacrifices." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The place itself provided the lesson. Later that afternoon, we sat on a bench overlooking part of the cemetery. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Then Richard surprised me again. "I owe your father an apology." I turned toward him. "He isn't here." "I know." His voice trembled slightly. "But I owe him one anyway." I waited. Richard looked down at his hands. "When I mocked your family, I thought I was judging social status." He laughed sadly. "I wasn't." "What were you judging?" He looked at me. The values that made you who you are. My throat tightened, because that was exactly the truth. Not just about my father. About all of them. My mother, my grandfather, the generations before them. The values that shaped me. Duty, humility, service, responsibility, sacrifice. Things that don't show up on bank statements, yet somehow matter more than money ever could. That evening back at the hotel, Richard sat quietly for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." He hesitated, then asked the question that mattered most. "Do you think your father would forgive me?" I stared at him. Not because the question surprised me, because I already knew the answer. I thought about my father, the countless sailors he had mentored, the mistakes he'd forgiven, the grace he'd extended, the patience he'd shown. Then I smiled softly. "Yes." Richard looked relieved. "But..." The word stopped him. I continued. "He'd expect you to learn from it." Richard nodded immediately. "I have." I believed him. Not because he said it. Because I had watched it happen. Day by day. Conversation by conversation. Choice by choice. When we returned to Charleston, something subtle had changed. The tension between us hadn't completely disappeared. Trust doesn't rebuild overnight. Neither does respect. But for the first time in a long time, we were moving in the right direction. Not backward. Forward. Together. And as I looked at the old Navy watch resting on my wrist one evening, I realized something important. The greatest revenge had never been public humiliation. It wasn't watching Richard feel embarrassed. It wasn't seeing him criticized. Real revenge was something much quieter. Watching someone finally understand the value of what they once dismissed. Watching ignorance become wisdom. Watching pride become humility. Watching a man become better than he was before. And for the first time since the gala, I began to wonder whether our story might still have a hopeful ending. A year later, I found myself standing in the same ballroom where everything had begun. The same crystal chandeliers. The same harbor view. The same annual charity gala. Even the same string quartet played softly near the stage. Yet somehow the room felt entirely different. Or perhaps I was the one who had changed. Maybe both. I adjusted the sleeve of my evening dress and glanced at the old Navy watch on my wrist. My father's watch. The watch that had quietly carried his legacy into that ballroom a year earlier. The watch that had revealed truths neither Richard nor I were prepared to face. A year. 12 short months. And yet it felt much longer. Because growth has a way of stretching time. Richard approached carrying 2 glasses of sparkling water. He handed one to me. His smile was relaxed. Natural. Not the carefully polished smile he used to wear at social events. A genuine one. "Ready?" he asked. I nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." He chuckled. "That's usually your answer." "Because it's usually true." We shared a laugh. A simple moment. The kind married couples often overlook. Yet after the previous year, I appreciated those moments more than ever. Richard had changed. Not perfectly. Nobody changes perfectly. At 62 years old, he still loved business. Still enjoyed ambitious projects. Still appreciated success, but success no longer defined his entire worldview. The shift wasn't dramatic. It was visible in small choices, the most meaningful kind. He had begun volunteering with veteran organizations, quietly, without publicity, without posting photos, without announcing it to anyone. He simply showed up, week after week, month after month, helping where he could, learning where he couldn't, listening more than talking. The first time I saw him unloading supplies at a veterans housing program, I nearly cried. Not because he was volunteering, because nobody had asked him to. Several months earlier, General Bradley had invited us to lunch. The 3 of us sat together overlooking Charleston Harbor. The conversation drifted from military history to family aging and purpose. At one point, the general leaned back and smiled at Richard. "You've come a long way." Richard laughed. "I had a good teacher." The general pointed toward me. "No." Then he pointed toward the watch. "Your teacher was wearing that watch long before either of us met her." The 3 of us sat quietly for a moment. Then General Bradley added something I'll never forget. "The greatest leaders don't leave behind wealth." He paused. "They leave behind values." Even now those words echo in my mind. Because they're true. As the gala continued, guests moved through the ballroom. Some recognized me. Some didn't. That was perfectly fine. I've never needed attention. Neither had my father. Across the room I noticed several veterans gathered near a display honoring local service members. Richard was speaking with them, not as a businessman, not as a donor, simply as another human being, listening, learning, respecting. A year ago, I never would have imagined that scene. Yet there it was, real, quiet, meaningful. Later in the evening, the event organizer stepped onto the stage. After welcoming guests, she invited several community leaders to stand for recognition. Richard's name was among them. He looked surprised, genuinely surprised. As polite applause filled the room, he reluctantly stood. Then something happened that touched me deeply. The organizer asked each honoree to briefly introduce themselves. One by one, they spoke about businesses, organizations, and accomplishments. Eventually, it was Richard's turn. He walked to the microphone. The ballroom grew quiet. I watched him carefully, curious what he would say. A year earlier, he would have listed achievements, projects, investments, professional successes. Instead, he smiled and looked toward me. Then he said, "My name is Richard Collins." A brief pause followed. "I'm fortunate to be married to an extraordinary woman." I felt my face grow warm. The room laughed softly. Richard continued, "She comes from a family that spent generations serving others." His voice grew steadier. "A family that taught me an important lesson." The ballroom remained silent, listening. "Real greatness isn't measured by money." He glanced toward me. "It's measured by character." I felt tears forming. Not because of the audience, not because of the applause, because I knew how difficult those words had been for him to earn. He wasn't repeating something he had heard. He believed it. That made all the difference. After the event ended, we stepped outside onto the harbor terrace. The night air felt cool. Boats moved slowly across the dark water. City lights shimmered in the distance. For several minutes, we simply stood together. No speeches, no dramatic declarations. Just peace. Finally, Richard spoke. "You know something? What? I used to think your father was the most impressive person in this story." I smiled. "He probably is." Richard shook his head. "No." I looked at him. He squeezed my hand. "You are." Emotion caught in my throat. "Why?" His answer came immediately. "Because you could have humiliated me." I laughed softly. "You handled that yourself." He laughed too. Then his expression became serious. "You could have walked away." I didn't respond. Because he was right. There had been moments when leaving seemed easier. Moments when anger felt justified. Moments when bitterness would have been understandable. Yet my father had taught me something important. People are more than their worst moments. Sometimes they deserve the opportunity to become better. Not always, but sometimes Richard had earned that opportunity. And thankfully he had used it well. As we stood there overlooking Charleston Harbor, I thought about my father, my grandfather, my mother, the generations who had shaped me. None of them had been wealthy. None of them had sought recognition. Yet their influence remained alive. Not through monuments, not through headlines, through values. Values passed from one life to another, one family member to another, one generation to the next. That is how legacies survive. Not in bank accounts, in people. I looked down at my father's watch. The hands continued moving steadily. Tick, tick, tick. Time passing, just as it always had. For the first time since his death, I felt something close to peace. Not because people finally knew who he was. He never would have cared about that. Because the lessons he spent a lifetime teaching were still alive, still working, still changing lives, even Richard's, especially Richard's. And perhaps that's the greatest legacy any of us can hope to leave behind. If this story reminded you of someone who quietly served, sacrificed, or shaped your life without asking for recognition, take a moment to think about them today. And if you've ever learned an important lesson from someone you once misunderstood, I'd love for you to share that experience. Stories like these help us remember what truly matters. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take care of yourselves, take care of one another, and never underestimate the quiet people in the room. Sometimes they're carrying the greatest stories of all. Captain Abigail Harper. The voice on the phone was trembling. I was standing in my kitchen at 11:43 on a humid South Carolina night, still half unpacking from my honeymoon, when the man on the other end lowered his voice and said words that froze the blood in my veins. "Abigail, I discovered something terrible. Come to my office immediately, and whatever you do, don't tell your father." For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. Then he added 5 words that changed my life forever. "It's about your father's DNA. Aline." 30 minutes later, I was driving through downtown Charleston, in full Marine Corps service uniform, my hands locked tight around the steering wheel. Even now, looking back, I can still feel the weight of that drive. The city was quiet, washed in yellow streetlight and summer heat. The harbor breeze carried the smell of salt through my cracked window. Most people were asleep in their tidy homes with porch lights glowing soft against old brick and magnolia trees. Ordinary people living ordinary lives. I remember envying them. At 28, I thought my life was settled, predictable. I'd done everything right. Graduated college with honors. Commissioned into the United States Marine Corps. Earned my captain's bars after 6 hard years of service. Married Daniel, a steady, thoughtful Navy lieutenant who never raised his voice and always made the coffee before I woke. And through it all, my father had stood there like an immovable stone. Richard Harper. Tall, controlled, emotionally reserved. A Charleston businessman who believed discipline was the highest virtue and affection was best left unspoken. He wasn't cruel. Not exactly. But love from Richard Harper came wrapped in expectation. He paid for my education. He attended every promotion ceremony. He shook Daniel's hand at our wedding and said, "Don't disappoint her." But he never hugged me. Not once after childhood. And every time I wore my dress blues, he looked at me with something close to contempt. 2 months earlier, when I stood before family and friends at my promotion ceremony, he leaned close and muttered, "Playing soldier doesn't make you important, Abby." I smiled through it, like always, because he was my father. And because children, even grown ones in uniform, spend their lives trying to earn approval that may never come. St. Joseph Medical Center stood quiet under the moonlight when I arrived. Dr. Michael Carter was waiting at the side entrance. He looked pale, too pale. His gray hair was damp against his forehead, and his usual calm physician's smile was nowhere to be found. "Captain Harper." "What happened?" I asked. He glanced over his shoulder before speaking. "Come with me." He led me down a private corridor toward his office. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere distant, a monitor beeped steadily. Hospital sounds. Familiar sounds. My father had been here all week preparing for kidney transplant evaluation. His health had been declining for nearly a year, though he'd fought the diagnosis with his usual stubborn silence. Dr. Carter closed the office door behind us and locked it. That was the moment I knew this wasn't about medicine. He crossed to his desk and picked up a sealed folder. Then he looked me straight in the eye. "Captain, before I show you this, I need your word. You won't confront your father until you've seen everything." A cold knot tightened in my stomach. "What is this?" He hesitated. Then he slid the file across the desk. "During transplant screening, we ran compatibility DNA analysis." I frowned. "That's standard." "Yes." He swallowed hard. "But your father's results raised an anomaly." I opened the folder. At first, the pages looked like meaningless medical data. Then I saw the highlighted line. Paternity excluded 99.99%. The room tilted. I actually laughed. Not because anything was funny, because my mind refused to process what my eyes were seeing. "This is wrong." Dr. Carter said nothing. I looked again. The numbers didn't change. "No," I whispered. "No, this is some clerical mistake." He sat slowly across from me. "Abigail, I reran the test 3 times myself." I stared at him. The silence stretched. Then he reached into his desk drawer and removed a second folder. This one older, yellowed at the edges. He placed it gently beside the first. 28 years ago, he said quietly, a paternity analysis was performed at this hospital under sealed authorization. I felt my pulse hammering in my throat. By who? He looked ashamed. Your father paid to have the results buried. For several seconds, I couldn't move. Couldn't blink. Couldn't think. Then with shaking hands, I opened the second file. Inside was another DNA report. Older formatting. Official seals. And one line typed cleanly across the page. Biological father match confirmed. Beneath it was a name I knew as well as my own. A name every Marine in America knew. General Nathaniel Reeves, United States Marine Corps. The folder slipped from my hands and struck the floor. I couldn't breathe. General Reeves, America's most decorated living Marine. The man whose portrait hung in command buildings across the country. The man who had pinned my captain's bars on my collar 6 months earlier at Camp Lejeune. The man who had paused afterward looked into my eyes and said something I'd never understood. Your mother would have been proud. At the time, I thought it was formal kindness. A polite military blessing. Now those words hit me like artillery fire. Dr. Carter's voice sounded far away. There's more. I looked up slowly. He slid a photograph across the desk. A young woman in marine dress blues smiled beside a younger Nathaniel Reeves. Her hand rested gently against her stomach. My stomach. My knees buckled. Because the woman smiling at the camera was my mother. And written on the back in faded blue ink were 5 words that shattered what remained of my world. Waiting for Abigail to arrive. I sank into the chair, unable to speak, unable to think, unable to understand how the man I called father had stolen 28 years of truth. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the grief and shock and disbelief, something colder began to rise. Not rage, not yet. Something quieter, something far more dangerous. The need to know why, and once I knew, what I would do with the truth. I did not sleep that night. I drove home just before dawn, parked in the driveway of the Charleston house where I had grown up, and sat behind the wheel staring at the dark windows as if I were looking at a stranger's home. Inside, Daniel was still asleep. Inside, the life I thought I understood was still waiting for me. And somewhere upstairs, folded neatly in a cedar chest I had not opened in 15 years, I suddenly knew there had to be answers. When I finally stepped through the front door, Daniel was already standing in the kitchen. He had that Navy habit of waking instantly alert no matter the hour. His dark hair was rumpled and his expression tightened the moment he saw my face. "Abby." I couldn't speak. I simply handed him the file. He read the first page, then the second. Then he looked up slowly and I saw the shock settle into him like cold rain. My God. I sat down hard at the kitchen table. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. The coffee maker clicked on automatically at 5:30, just as it did every morning. The smell filled the room with a comforting familiarity that suddenly felt obscene. Ordinary life continuing while mine had just collapsed. Finally, Daniel sat beside me. "Do you believe it?" I stared at the polished wood grain of the table. "I don't know what to believe." He reached for my hand. I let him take it, though my fingers felt numb. "What are you going to do?" I thought of Richard. He was still asleep at St. Joseph, probably unaware his entire lie was unraveling. The thought should have comforted me. Instead, it made me sick. "I need proof," I said quietly. By 7 o'clock, I was climbing the narrow attic stairs in my childhood home. The house had belonged to my mother before Richard bought out her share after she died. He'd never changed much. Same floral wallpaper in the upstairs hallway, same antique brass fixtures, same faint scent of cedar and old books. The attic was exactly as I remembered. Dusty beams, cardboard boxes stacked with military precision, and in the far corner beneath the small dormer window sat the cedar chest. I hadn't opened it since I was 13. The brass latch resisted before finally giving way with a sharp metallic snap. Inside lay my mother's life. Folded sweaters, a silk scarf, old perfume bottles long dried empty, and beneath them, wrapped carefully in white linen, her Marine Corps dress blues. I froze. My mother had been a Marine. I had never known. Richard had told me she'd been a school teacher. Hands trembling, I unfolded the jacket. Captain's bars gleamed faintly beneath the dust. My breath caught. Captain Eleanor Reeves, not Harper. Reeves. The name struck me like a physical blow. Beneath the uniform lay her dog tags. And under those, letters. Dozens of them tied neatly with faded blue ribbon. I sat cross-legged on the attic floor and opened the first. The handwriting was firm and unmistakably military. "My dearest Eleanor, if this deployment keeps me longer than expected, promise me you'll tell Abigail her father already loves her more than life itself." My vision blurred. I opened another. And another. Each signed the same way. "Forever yours, Nathaniel?" By the 4th letter, I was openly shaking. Then I found the newspaper clipping. The Charleston Gazette, October 1994. Marine Major Nathaniel Reeves presumed killed in classified Beirut operation. A grainy photograph showed a younger version of the man who had pinned my promotion bars. The article explained his body had never been recovered. Presumed dead. I remembered what Richard had always told me. "Your mother was widowed young. She never recovered from losing your father." A lie. All of it. Because if Nathaniel had been presumed dead, then Richard had entered her life afterward. He had not been my father abandoned by tragedy. He had been the man who stepped into tragedy and built a lie inside it. At the bottom of the chest sat one final envelope, unsealed. No stamp, no date. I opened it carefully. The handwriting was my mother's. "If Abigail ever learns the truth, tell Nathaniel immediately. Richard cannot be trusted to do what is right." The room spun. I read it again. And again. My mother knew. She knew Richard would lie. And she had tried to leave a path back to the truth. A sound behind me made me jerk around. Daniel stood in the doorway, pale as ash. He must have read my face because he crossed the room without speaking and knelt beside me. I handed him the note. He read silently. Then he exhaled long and slow. Abby, she knew. My voice cracked. She knew what he'd do. Daniel sat beside me. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Finally, he said gently, "There's more." I frowned. He handed me his phone. The screen showed a text message from an unknown number. Richard Harper requested immediate discharge from St. Joseph at 6:12 a.m., left against medical advice. My blood ran cold. "He knows," Daniel said. I stood so fast the letters scattered across the floor. Number. Daniel rose with me. "Abby, no, he doesn't get to run." For 28 years, Richard Harper had controlled every version of my life. He had shaped my childhood, buried my truth, and worn the title of father, while another man grieved a daughter he believed dead. And now that his lie had surfaced, he thought he could simply disappear. Number. I wiped my eyes and squared my shoulders with the reflexive precision of a Marine officer preparing for orders. For the first time in my life, I felt something colder than grief settle inside me. Resolve. Not revenge born of rage. Something cleaner. More exact. Truth. And Richard Harper was going to answer for every stolen year. Then Daniel's phone buzzed again. A second text. 3 words. "He's gone home." I looked toward the attic window, toward the long oak-lined driveway below. And right then, through the morning fog, I saw Richard's black sedan pulling slowly into the drive. He had come back. And this time, I was waiting. Richard Harper stood in the center of my childhood living room as if nothing had happened. He wore pressed khakis and a pale blue button-down shirt, the kind he'd worn every Sunday for as long as I could remember. His silver hair was neatly combed. His expression was calm. Too calm. He looked exactly like the man who had raised me. That was what unsettled me most. How ordinary evil can look. When he saw me step into the room, his face softened into something almost fatherly. "Abby," he said gently, "you're home early." I stared at him. For 28 years, I had looked into that face and seen certainty, stability, authority. Now all I could see was the architecture of deception. Daniel stood quietly behind me, saying nothing. Richard's eyes flicked briefly toward him, then back to me. "What's wrong?" I said nothing. I simply walked forward and placed my mother's note on the coffee table between us. The room went still. Richard looked down. I watched the exact moment recognition struck him. His face lost color. He didn't touch the note. Didn't pretend not to know what it was. He simply closed his eyes for one long second. And when he opened them, he looked 20 years older. "Where did you find that?" "In the attic," I said. My voice surprised me. It sounded calm, steady, Marine calm. The kind of calm that comes before action. He exhaled slowly and lowered himself into his leather chair. For a moment, he looked tired enough to tell the truth. Instead, he asked quietly, "Did Carter contact you?" The question itself was answer enough. I folded my arms. "Yes." Richard gave a bitter little laugh. I should have known Michael would lose his nerve eventually. The casualness of it made something twist inside me. "You paid him to hide my paternity test." His jaw tightened. "Yes." The single word hit harder than denial would have. No excuses. No shock. No performance. Just fact. Daniel shifted behind me, but I held up a hand. I wanted this. Needed this. Why? Richard looked at me, then really looked at me, and what I saw there unsettled me more than anger would have. Love. Broken, selfish, desperate love. Because I was afraid. I laughed sharply. Afraid? Yes. He rose slowly and walked to the window, staring out toward the old magnolia tree in the yard. "You were 2 years old when your mother died." The words landed like stones. My mother had never been discussed in detail. Richard always dismissed questions with the same answer. "It hurts too much." I'd stopped asking by 12. Now his voice was distant, almost reflective. Nathaniel was overseas again. Classified deployment. No contact. The military declared him missing. I said nothing. Richard's shoulders sagged. Eleanor believed he'd come home. She refused to let go. His voice broke slightly. "I loved her, Abigail. God help me, I loved her for years before she ever noticed me." The confession filled the room with something ugly and intimate. She was grieving, vulnerable. I told myself I was helping her, protecting both of you. His hands clenched behind his back. Then she became sick. A cold dread crept through me. "What happened?" He closed his eyes. "Cancer. Aggressive. By the time they found it, there was nothing anyone could do." I felt my knees weaken. No one had ever told me that. "Not once," Richard continued quietly. "She made me promise to care for you if Nathaniel never returned." I swallowed hard. And when he did return, Richard turned toward me. The grief in his face looked real. That was the terrible part. I had already buried her, already held you through your nightmares, already become your father in every way that mattered. His voice roughened. And then Nathaniel came home alive. The room seemed to shrink. He came to Charleston asking questions, looking for Eleanor, looking for you. I could barely breathe. What did you tell him? Richard looked directly into my eyes. I told him you both died. The words struck like a rifle shot. For several seconds no one moved. No one spoke. Then I heard myself whisper, "You let him believe his wife and daughter were dead." Richard's voice cracked. Yes. The honesty made it worse, because there was no defense in it. Only guilt. Only truth. My whole body trembled, but not from weakness. From the effort it took not to shatter. How could you? He stepped toward me. Instinctively I stepped back. The pain on his face deepened. I loved you. No, I said quietly. My voice was steady now, steel wrapped in sorrow. You loved keeping me. He flinched. And in that moment I knew I was right. Silence stretched between us. Finally I asked the question that mattered most. Does he know? Richard looked confused. Nathaniel. His face tightened. Number. A lie. I saw it instantly. Marine training teaches you to read hesitation the way civilians read weather. His pupils narrowed. His breath caught. His shoulders locked. He was lying. I turned to Daniel. Get my car keys. Richard's composure broke. Abigail, don't. I met his eyes. Where is he? Please, where is he? He looked suddenly afraid. Then he whispered Paris Island. My heart stopped. He's there now. Richard nodded. He requested private leave this morning after Carter called him. Of course, someone had told him. For 28 years, General Nathaniel Reeves had believed his daughter was dead. And right now he knew otherwise. I turned for the door. Richard moved fast for a man his age, catching my arm. Abigail, listen to me. I looked down at his hand, then back at his face. The man who had raised me. The man who had lied to me every day of my life. For a brief, impossible second, I remembered being 6 years old with a skinned knee, him lifting me onto the kitchen counter while he bandaged it with careful hands. That memory hurt more than any lie, because part of him had loved me, and part of me had loved him back. Quietly, I removed his hand. Then I said the hardest words I had ever spoken. You don't get to stop this anymore. 2 hours later, I stood at Marine Corps Recruit Depot, Paris Island. And through the window of the commandant's private office, I saw him, General Nathaniel Reeves, standing in full dress blues, waiting for me. I had met generals before. In the Marine Corps, rank carries its own gravity. The room shifts when a general officer enters. Conversations sharpen, shoulders straighten, time itself seems to move differently. But nothing prepared me for standing face to face with General Nathaniel Reeves and seeing my own eyes looking back at me. His office at Paris Island was spare and immaculate, exactly what I would have expected from a man whose reputation had become legend in the Corps. Framed commendations lined one wall. A model of the Eagle Globe and Anchor sat centered on a polished walnut shelf. Through the broad windows behind his desk, recruits could be seen crossing the parade deck in perfect formation under the South Carolina sun. He stood when I entered. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He was taller than I'd imagined. Late 50s, broad-shouldered, despite age, his silver hair cut close. The years had hardened his face into clean lines of discipline and endurance. But his eyes, those were my eyes, gray-blue, sharp and searching. And suddenly all the breath left my body. He took one careful step toward me as though approaching something fragile enough to break. Captain Harper. His voice was steady, but only just. I stood at attention, automatically, every Marine instinct rising to the surface. Sir? He gave the faintest shake of his head. At ease. I obeyed. He studied my face for what felt like forever. Then he whispered words so quiet I barely heard them. Eleanor's smile. And just like that, whatever professional composure I'd brought with me cracked. I looked away first. The room blurred slightly. He noticed. His voice gentled. You don't have to stand like a Marine right now. I swallowed hard. I don't know how else to stand. That drew the smallest smile from him. And for one impossible second I felt something shift between us. Recognition. Not certainty, but possibility. He gestured toward the chairs near the window. Please. I sat. He remained standing for a moment, gathering himself, then lowered into the chair opposite mine with deliberate control. The kind of control men learn when they've spent years carrying grief too heavy to set down. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he folded his hands and spoke plainly. I loved your mother more than I have ever loved anything in this life. The honesty in his voice was devastating. There was no performance in it. No manipulation. Only truth. I nodded for him to continue. He exhaled slowly. We met at Quantico. She was the finest logistics officer I'd ever seen. Smarter than me, which irritated me tremendously. A faint smile touched his mouth. She corrected a deployment routing error I'd missed in front of half the battalion, then apologized afterward because she thought she'd embarrassed me. Despite myself, I smiled. That sounded like someone I would have liked. She was brilliant, he said softly, and kind in ways this world rarely rewards. He looked down briefly. We married 6 months later. The words settled heavily between us. Not because they shocked me anymore, but because hearing them aloud made everything real. She became pregnant with you during my second overseas rotation. We were happy. His voice roughened. Then Beirut happened. I had read enough military history to know. The classified operation gone catastrophically wrong. Multiple casualties. Survivors extracted weeks later under secrecy orders. He had been one of them. I was listed missing. Communications were blacked out. For 37 days, no one outside command knew whether I was alive. His eyes met mine. When I came home, Richard met me at Eleanor's gravesite. My stomach clenched. He told me she'd died during childbirth complications, that the baby had died with her. I felt physically ill. The memory of Richard standing in our living room admitting it with such quiet certainty returned like acid. Nathaniel's voice dropped lower. I believed him. The pain in those 2 words filled the room. I could hardly breathe through it. I spent years trying to understand why God would let me survive war only to come home to that kind of loss. He looked toward the parade deck outside. I considered ending my career, nearly ended my life if I'm honest. I froze. He glanced back at me. Duty saved me. Sometimes it's all that does. I understood that better than most. He leaned forward then and opened a folder on the table between us. Inside were photographs. My mother laughing beside him on a dock. Their wedding. Ultrasound scans. A grainy photo of Eleanor visibly pregnant smiling directly into the camera. My throat tightened. I touched the edge of one picture with trembling fingers. She kept all these. She mailed duplicates to my deployment address. His jaw flexed. They were returned unopened after I was declared missing. Richard signed for them. The room tilted again. Proof. Cold and absolute. No possibility of misunderstanding. Richard had intercepted everything. For nearly 30 years he had guarded this lie like treasure. And in that moment the shape of my revenge became clear. Not fury. Not destruction. Truth. Public undeniable truth. I looked up. What do you want from me? Nathaniel's expression changed instantly. Softened. Nothing. The word surprised me. He sat straighter. You owe me nothing, Abigail. Not trust, not affection, not forgiveness for years I couldn't be there. His voice faltered for the first time. I would settle for the chance to know the woman my daughter became. Something inside me broke open then. Not fully, but enough. I looked at this man, the stranger who was not a stranger at all, and saw none of Richard's possession. No claim. Only hope. And grief. And love patient enough to wait. That was when my phone rang. Daniel. I answered immediately. His voice was urgent. Abby, you need to come home. Ice slid through me. What happened? It's your father. A pause. Then, he emptied every account he had this morning. My pulse hammered. He's leaving. No, Daniel said grimly. He's not leaving. I heard voices in the background, papers shuffling. Then Daniel's next words stopped my heart. He's gathered the whole family at the house tonight. Why? Another pause. When Daniel answered, his voice was heavy with understanding. He knows the truth is out. I looked at Nathaniel. He was already rising to his feet, and in his eyes I saw exactly what I felt. After 28 years of lies, Richard Harper had finally decided to face judgment. By the time Nathaniel and I reached Charleston, dusk had settled over the city like a heavy curtain. The old Harper house stood lit from end to end, every downstairs window glowing gold against the darkening sky. Cars lined both sides of the oak-shaded street. My father's black sedan sat in the driveway like a silent accusation. He had invited everyone, aunts and uncles, cousins I saw only at holidays, family friends who had known me since childhood, people who had toasted my wedding only weeks earlier and still believed Richard Harper was the proud father of a successful Marine officer. He had gathered witnesses, not to escape, to confess. Nathaniel parked beside Daniel's car and shut off the engine. For a moment, neither of us moved. The silence inside the vehicle was strange and intimate, filled with everything neither of us yet knew how to say. Finally, Nathaniel spoke. Whatever happens tonight, Abigail, you set the terms. I looked at him. The dashboard light cut soft shadows across his face, revealing both strength and age. This man had commanded thousands, had survived combat loss and 30 years of grief. Yet he was handing control to me without hesitation. It was such a different kind of fatherhood from the one I'd known that it nearly undid me. I nodded once. Together we went inside. The house was silent when we entered. Every conversation stopped. Nearly 20 people stood gathered in the living room. My Aunt Carol's hand flew to her mouth when she saw Nathaniel beside me. Others simply stared. Richard stood near the fireplace, one hand braced against the mantel for support. He looked smaller somehow, older than he had that morning. His eyes found Nathaniel first, then me. And for the first time in my life I saw fear in Richard Harper. Not fear of punishment. Fear of losing what he had stolen. Daniel stepped quietly to my side. His hand brushed mine once, steadying, grounding. Then Richard spoke. His voice was low and formal. "Thank you all for coming." No one answered. He looked directly at the room. "There are things I have hidden for nearly 30 years. Tonight they end." He glanced toward me. I gave no reaction. Whatever happened next was his burden to carry. He drew a long breath. Then he told them everything. Not elegantly, not defensively. Plainly, he spoke of meeting Eleanor when Nathaniel was deployed, of loving her hopelessly, of caring for her through illness after Nathaniel was presumed dead, of learning she was dying, of the promise she made him swear to care for me if Nathaniel never returned. Then came the moment that changed him from caretaker to thief. When Nathaniel came home alive, Richard said quietly, "I couldn't bear to lose her all over again." The room remained perfectly still. His voice broke. So I lied. No one moved. No one interrupted. He described telling Nathaniel that Eleanor and I had died. Described intercepting letters. Destroying records. Paying doctors to bury DNA results when questions arose years later. Each word stripped him bare, and somehow hearing it all aloud hurt less than I expected. Because truth has a strange mercy. Once spoken, it stops poisoning the dark. When he finished, silence filled the room like prayer. Then Aunt Carol whispered what everyone was thinking. "How could you do something so monstrous?" Richard didn't answer. He simply lowered his head. Then, unexpectedly, he turned toward Nathaniel. The two men faced each other across 30 years of ruin. Richard's voice shook. "I stole your life." Nathaniel said nothing. Richard swallowed hard. "I told myself I loved her. Loved Abigail, that keeping them was mercy." He looked at me then, and I saw no manipulation left in him. Only sorrow. But love built on theft isn't love at all. Tears burned my eyes. He had finally understood. Too late. But truly. Before anyone could speak, Richard staggered. His hand flew to his side. His face went gray. Then he collapsed. The ambulance arrived within minutes. Years of military crisis training took over. I dropped beside him, checking airway and pulse, while Daniel called commands to arriving paramedics. Richard's skin was cold and clammy, his breathing shallow. Dr. Carter met us at St. Joseph's emergency entrance. One look at Richard's labs and his face darkened. His kidneys are crashing, faster than expected. They rushed him upstairs. The family remained in stunned clusters throughout the waiting area. No one knew what to say. I sat beside Daniel in numb silence. Across from us, Nathaniel stood at the window looking out over Charleston Harbor, still straight-backed, still composed. But I could see his hands trembling faintly behind him. Dr. Carter returned an hour later. His expression was grave. "There's only one immediate donor match." The room seemed to hold its breath. Carter looked directly at Nathaniel. "General Reeves." The silence that followed felt endless. I stared at him. "Surely not. Not after everything. Not after 30 years stolen." Nathaniel absorbed the news without visible reaction. Then he asked the only question that mattered. "Will it save him?" Dr. Carter nodded. "With very strong odds." Nathaniel looked toward Richard's room. When he spoke, his voice was calm. "Prepare the operating room." I rose so quickly my chair scraped harshly against the floor. "What?" He turned to me. There was no anger in his face. No triumph. Only something deeper. Peace. "You don't owe him this," I said. "No," he agreed. "I don't." "Then why?" For a moment his expression softened into something almost fatherly. "Because it was fatherly. Because if I let bitterness decide this night," he said quietly, "then Richard steals one more thing from both of us." My throat tightened. He stepped closer, and in front of our stunned family, General Nathaniel Reeves gently placed a hand on my shoulder. "Abigail, revenge reveals character." His voice lowered. "Tonight, let ours reveal honor." I broke then. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just silent tears finally released after 28 years of lies I had never known I carried. And for the first time in my life I leaned into my father. My real father, as orderlies wheeled him toward surgery to save the man who had stolen him from me. Richard Harper survived the surgery. The doctors told us later that if Nathaniel had waited even another hour to agree, Richard likely would have died before morning. I remember sitting in the recovery waiting room just before dawn, staring at the first pale streaks of sunlight spreading across Charleston Harbor beyond the hospital windows. It was one of those quiet southern mornings that always seem older than time itself, the kind where the world feels washed clean. For the first time in 30 hours, no one was speaking. Daniel sat beside me, his hand loosely wrapped around mine. Across from us, Nathaniel rested in a reclining chair, pale from anesthesia, but sitting upright anyway because men like him had spent a lifetime refusing to collapse in front of others. He caught me looking and gave me a faint smile. It was small, tired, real, and something inside me eased. Dr. Carter stepped into the room carrying 2 paper cups of hospital coffee and handed one to Nathaniel. "You should be resting." Nathaniel accepted it with a slight nod. "I've spent 30 years waiting to know my daughter. I can rest later." The words struck me harder than they should have. Not because they were dramatic, because they weren't. They were spoken with the plain certainty of truth. That was what made them powerful. I had spent most of my life around carefully managed emotions, love rationed out in practical gestures never spoken too plainly. Richard had believed affection became weaker when named aloud. Nathaniel seemed to believe the opposite. And I realized then how starved I had been for simple honesty. Richard woke late that afternoon. Dr. Carter allowed only immediate family inside. For the first time in my life, that phrase felt complicated. I entered first. He looked impossibly small against the white hospital sheets. The surgery had drained the color from his face. The force that had always defined him seemed diminished, as though truth itself had finally taken something from him. When his eyes opened and found mine, they filled instantly with tears. I had never seen Richard Harper cry. Not when my mother died. Not when I graduated boot camp. Not even when doctors told him his kidneys were failing. But now he wept openly. "Abigail." His voice cracked on my name. I stepped closer but remained standing. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he whispered why. I knew what he meant. Why had Nathaniel saved him? Why had mercy answered theft? Before I could respond, the door opened behind me. Nathaniel entered slowly, one hand resting lightly against his side. Richard stared at him as though seeing judgment itself. Nathaniel stopped beside the bed. And then he said something I will carry for the rest of my life. "You don't get to die before making this right." Richard broke. The sob that escaped him was raw and terrible, the sound of 30 years finally collapsing under their own weight. He covered his face with trembling hands. "I'm sorry." Nathaniel said nothing. Richard looked at me then. Really looked at me. Not as possession. Not as proof of his sacrifice. Not as something he had earned. Simply as his daughter, the woman he had wronged. "I thought loving you was enough," he whispered. His breathing hitched. "I thought raising you gave me the right to keep the truth." He swallowed hard. I was wrong. The room was utterly still. Then he said the words I had needed all my life. "I was proud of your uniform." Tears blurred my vision. He shook his head weakly. "I mocked it because every medal you earned reminded me whose daughter you truly were." I could hardly breathe. All those years. All those cold dismissals. Not contempt. Shame. A man punishing himself by withholding the pride he could not bear to feel. And suddenly I understood something age teaches better than youth ever can. People do terrible things not because they feel nothing, but because they feel too much and lack the courage to face it honestly. I stepped to the bedside. Richard looked up, frightened of what I might say. Quietly, I took his frail hand. "You were the man who raised me." His breath caught. I looked back toward Nathaniel. And he was the man stolen from me. Then I faced Richard again. "Both things are true." His mouth trembled. "Can you ever forgive me?" I thought of the answer carefully. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is not excusing. It is simply choosing not to live forever inside another person's sin. At last I nodded. Yes. He closed his eyes and wept. Not with relief. With gratitude. The honest kind. 6 months later, I stood on the parade field at Camp Lejeune beneath a bright Carolina sky as my promotion ceremony began. Rows of Marines stood sharp in dress blues. Families filled the bleachers. The brass band played softly in the distance. When my name was called, I stepped forward. Major Abigail Reeves Harper. The name had taken time to choose. and healing to deserve. Nathaniel stood on my right in full dress blues. Richard stood on my left, still thinner from recovery, but stronger every week. Together they pinned the gold oak leaves of Major to my collar. One father by blood, one by years, both changed by truth. As the applause rose around us, Nathaniel saluted first. Richard followed awkwardly, having practiced for weeks just to do it properly. I returned both salutes with tears in my eyes. And in that moment, standing between the men who had shaped my life through love and failure alike, I understood the lesson this story was always meant to teach. Secrets may shape a life for a season, but truth, however painful, sets it free. If this story has ever reminded you of someone you need to forgive, or someone who deserves your honesty before time runs out, don't wait. Life humbles all of us eventually. The brave thing is telling the truth before it has to break us open. And if this story moved, you share it with someone who may need that reminder too. And stay with us for more stories about family truth and the quiet courage it takes to come home. The sheriff stepped into my living room at exactly 7:14 p.m. Nobody in my family noticed him at first. My father was too busy pointing at the framed landscape above the fireplace, pretending admiration for a house he'd spent 4 years resenting me for owning. My younger brother Dean sat at my dining table with his legs spread wide, drinking 18-year-old bourbon like he already owned the place. And my mother kept looking around the room the way nervous people do when they know they shouldn't be somewhere. Then Sheriff Walter Briggs cleared his throat. The sound stopped everything. Dean nearly dropped his glass. My father slowly turned around, and Walter, calm as a winter morning, removed his hat and said, "Evening, Raymond." I watched the blood drain from my father's face. That was the moment he realized this wasn't a family reunion. It was a reckoning. 4 years earlier, I never would have imagined sitting in that Colorado mountain house with cameras recording every word my family said. Back then, I was still the obedient daughter from Ash Creek, Ohio. The daughter who did what she was told. The daughter my father traded away. I was 24 years old when Raymond Carter informed me I was getting married. Not asked. Told. It happened on a Thursday evening in late October, right after supper. I still remember the smell of beef stew hanging in the kitchen while cold rain tapped against the farmhouse windows. Dad sat at the head of the table with both hands folded like a banker closing a deal. Mom kept drying the same plate over and over without looking up. And Dean leaned back in his chair, smirking before anyone said a word. That should have warned me. "Victor Hale asked for you," my father said. I laughed at first. Not because it was funny, because it sounded insane. Victor Hale was almost 60 years old. He owned half the commercial property in 3 counties. People around Ash Creek spoke his name quietly like they were discussing somebody dangerous. 2 wives dead. One drowned at his lake property. Another fell down a staircase in Denver. No charges. No proof. Just rumors thick enough to stick to a man forever. "You can't be serious," I said. Dad stared at me hard. I already gave him my word. That sentence changed my life. I remember standing so quickly my chair scraped across the floor. "You gave him your word," I asked, "about me." Dean snorted into his drink. Mom whispered Elena, but she still wouldn't look at me. Dad's jaw tightened. "You know what's happening to this farm." I did know. The drought had nearly ruined us. My father had borrowed against the land 3 times. There were rumors he owed money beyond the bank loans too. Gambling. Cards. Sports betting. Things small-town men swear they can control until they can't. "You're selling me," I said quietly. Dad slammed his hand on the table. "I am saving this family." I still remember how cold I felt standing there. Not angry at first. Just cold. Like something inside me finally understood I had never truly belonged to myself. "He killed his wives," I whispered. "That's gossip," Dad snapped. "Then why won't anyone say it out loud?" Nobody answered. Not even Mom. That hurt worst of all. Victor Hale arrived 2 days later. A black Lincoln rolled up our gravel driveway just after noon. I expected some monster from the rumors. What stepped out surprised me. Victor was tall but moved stiffly like his body hurt him. Silver hair, dark overcoat, sharp eyes that looked tired more than cruel. He shook my father's hand first. That told me everything. Business before family. Then he looked at me. Not like a man choosing cattle. Not even like a groom. More like somebody studying damage in another human being because he recognized it in himself. "You don't want this marriage," he said plainly. The honesty caught me off guard. "No," I answered. Dad immediately barked Elena. Victor raised one hand gently. "She's allowed to answer." Silence settled over the porch. Then Victor looked directly at me again. Neither do I. That confused me even more. We sat in the living room afterward while Dad rambled about land permits and grain prices. Victor barely listened. Eventually he asked if he could speak to me privately outside. Dad hesitated. Victor didn't wait for permission. We walked down toward the fence line where dead corn stalks bent in the autumn wind. Victor kept his hands in his coat pockets. "You've heard stories about me," he said. "Yes, and you believe them." I looked at him carefully. "I don't know what to believe." He nodded slowly. "That's probably the smartest answer anyone's given me in years." There was no charm in him. No false sweetness. Just exhaustion. He explained his first wife had drowned after drinking during a storm at the lake. The second struggled with prescription addiction for years before her accident. "People prefer monsters," he said quietly. "Makes life simpler." I asked him why he wanted to marry me. That answer stayed with me forever. "Because your father needed money," he said. "And because I got tired of eating dinner alone." No romance. No manipulation. Just truth so bare it hurt. I should have walked away anyway. Maybe a stronger woman would have. But small-town daughters raised by hard men understand something outsiders don't. Sometimes obedience gets planted in you so young it feels like survival. 3 weeks later, I married Victor Hale at the county courthouse. No church wedding. No reception. Just signatures, cold weather, and my mother crying silently into tissues she pretended not to need. Dad shook Victor's hand afterward like he'd closed the best deal of his life. That image haunted me for years. The first months in Colorado felt strange and lonely. Victor's house sat outside Cedar Ridge, tucked against the mountains where snow lingered deep into spring. The place was enormous but quiet. Too quiet. At night, I'd hear old heating pipes ticking through the walls and wonder whether I'd trapped myself inside a grave waiting to happen. But Victor never touched me cruelly. Never yelled. Never controlled where I went. Mostly he worked long hours in his study reviewing contracts and financial papers. Some evenings we ate dinner in complete silence. Other nights he surprised me by talking for hours about ranchers, mining disputes, or old Western movies. Slowly the fear I carried began changing shape. Not disappearing, just becoming confusion. One snowy evening about 8 months into the marriage, I finally asked him directly, "Did you love your wives?" Victor stared into the fireplace a long time before answering. "Yes," he said softly, "and I buried both of them." There was something broken in his voice that no liar could fake. That was the first night I realized Victor Hale might not be the villain everyone needed him to be. And maybe, just maybe, neither was I. By the second year of our marriage, I knew 2 things for certain. First, Victor Hale was not the man my hometown believed he was. And second, somebody around him was waiting for him to die. I just didn't know who yet. People imagine wealth looks glamorous from the inside. It doesn't. Not the kind Victor had. Old money has a heaviness to it, a loneliness, especially for men who spend decades wondering whether anyone around them actually cares if they wake up tomorrow. Victor rarely trusted people fully. At first I assumed it was arrogance. Later I understood it was survival. Every week somebody wanted something from him. Business partners wanting signatures. Distant relatives asking for temporary loans. Lawyers pushing him to revise ownership agreements. Even charity boards treated him less like a human being and more like a vault with legs. One morning during breakfast, I found him staring out the kitchen windows toward the mountains while untouched coffee cooled beside him. Snow covered the backyard fences in smooth white drifts. "You didn't sleep," I said. "I slept enough." "You say that every time you don't sleep." A faint smile crossed his face. That alone told me he was beginning to trust me. Victor wasn't naturally warm. His kindness came quietly, almost reluctantly, like somebody who forgot how to offer it. He folded the newspaper carefully. "Do you know why wealthy men become paranoid, Elena?" I shrugged. "Because everybody lies to them. Because eventually," he said, "they realize money makes people patient." That sentence stayed with me. At the time, I didn't fully understand it. I would later. Life in Cedar Ridge settled into routines. Quiet routines. Comfortable ones. I handled household accounts and eventually started helping Victor organize property records. He seemed surprised I learned quickly. Truthfully, nobody had ever bothered teaching me anything important before. Back in Ohio, my father treated me like temporary labor until marriage transferred ownership to somebody else. Victor, strangely enough, treated me more like an apprentice. Some evenings we sat for hours in his study surrounded by ledgers and contracts while jazz records played softly from an old stereo. He taught me how commercial leases worked, How land rights increased in value near future highways. How desperate people often revealed themselves during inheritance disputes. You can tell who someone really is, he once said, by watching them divide money after a funeral. At the time I thought he sounded cynical. Now I know he was experienced. Still, rumors followed him everywhere. At grocery stores, women stopped talking when I entered aisles. At church, people stared politely too long. One older waitress in town squeezed my hand one afternoon and whispered, "Be careful around stairs, honey." I drove home shaking after that. Victor noticed immediately. He listened quietly while I repeated what the woman said. Then he surprised me by laughing. Not cruelly, just tired. "People need stories," he said, "especially boring towns." "You're not angry." I stopped trying to defend myself years ago. That answer bothered me more than anger would have. "Why?" He looked at me carefully. "Because innocent people eventually learn something guilty people already know." "What's that?" "The truth doesn't always matter." About 6 months later, I finally saw the darker side of Victor's world. His business partner Leonard Voss came for dinner. Leonard was one of those polished men who smiled with every tooth but never with his eyes. Perfect gray hair, expensive watch, voice smooth as wet paint. The kind of man older women call charming and older men never trust. From the moment he entered the house, tension settled over Victor like storm clouds. At dinner, Leonard joked constantly about retirement. "You should finally slow down, Vic," he said while cutting steak. "Enjoy what's left of life." Victor's jaw tightened slightly. "What's left?" Leonard laughed too quickly. "You know what I mean." I noticed something then. Fear. Not in Leonard. In Victor. Small. Controlled. But real. That night after Leonard left, Victor checked every exterior door personally before sitting in the dark living room with a whiskey glass untouched beside him. "You think he's stealing from you?" I said quietly. Victor stared toward the windows. "I know he is." "Then why keep him around?" "Because men who panic become dangerous." I felt a chill move through me. "Dangerous how?" Victor looked at me for a very long time before answering. "The kind of dangerous that gets called accidental afterward." A month later, security cameras appeared around the property. Victor told contractors they were because of trespassers. Privately, he admitted something else. He no longer trusted certain people entering the estate. That included business associates, even relatives, especially relatives. Soon after, retired Sheriff Walter Briggs began visiting regularly. Walter was in his 70s then. Thick shoulders, white mustache, slow voice that carried authority without effort. The first time we met, he shook my hand firmly and said, "Victor finally found somebody decent. About time." Victor rolled his eyes, but I caught the faint amusement behind it. Walter became part friend, part security advisor, part watchdog. Some afternoons, the three of us sat on the back porch drinking coffee while snow melted across the valley below. Walter distrusted almost everyone connected to Victor's business affairs, especially Leonard Voss. "Men who smile too much around money make me nervous," Walter once muttered. Victor answered quietly, "You and me both." Despite all that tension, something unexpected happened between Victor and me. We became companions. Not dramatic romance. Not fairy tale love. Something steadier. Deeper. We learned each other's silences. Victor began waiting for me before dinner instead of eating alone in his study. I started reading beside the fireplace while he worked nearby. On Sundays, we drove mountain roads simply to escape phones and paperwork. One evening during a summer thunderstorm, the power went out across Cedar Ridge. We sat in candlelight listening to rain hammer the roof. Victor looked older in flickering light. More fragile somehow. "Do you regret marrying me?" he asked suddenly. I thought carefully before answering. "I regret why it happened." He nodded once. "That's fair." Then, after a long silence, he surprised me again. "You deserved a different beginning than the one your father sold you." No one had ever acknowledged that before. Not directly. Not honestly. I felt tears sting my eyes, which embarrassed me. Victor noticed anyway. "You know," he said quietly, "your father called 3 times asking for additional money after the wedding." I stared at him. "You gave it to him. The first 2 times. And the third. I told him his daughter wasn't an investment account." Something fierce and protective rose in my chest then. For the first time in my life, someone had chosen my dignity over my father's demands. The accident happened 11 months later. Cold rain covered the mountain highways that night. Victor had driven to Denver for meetings, despite Walter warning him to wait until morning. At 11:38 p.m., the state patrol called the house. Single vehicle crash. Guardrail failure. Vehicle overturned into a ravine. Instant death. I remember dropping the phone. I remember Walter catching me before I hit the floor. And I remember the awful silence afterward. The kind that changes a house permanently. At the funeral, people spoke softly about tragedy, while secretly measuring inheritance. Leonard Voss cried too dramatically. My father flew in from Ohio wearing a suit nicer than anything he'd owned in 20 years. That bothered me immediately, but not nearly as much as what happened after the burial. I walked into Victor's office searching for insurance documents when I found an envelope on his desk, my name written across the front in his handwriting. Inside was a copy of his revised will. Everything. The properties. The investments. The accounts. All of it belonged to me now. And attached to the back was a handwritten note. If anything ever happens to me, trust no one in your family. 4 years after Victor died, people still lowered their voices when they spoke about me in Cedar Ridge. Some called me the grieving widow. Others called me lucky. A few called me dangerous. None of them knew the truth. The truth was much quieter than gossip. Most mornings I woke before sunrise, made coffee in the same kitchen Victor once stood in, and watched snow settle over the mountains while the house creaked softly around me. Grief changes shape as you age. At first, it's sharp enough to cut through your ribs every hour. Later, it becomes heavier, slower. Like carrying wet blankets nobody else can see. For a long time after Victor's death, I barely spoke to anyone outside Walter Briggs and my attorney Daniel Mercer. Walter checked on me almost daily during that first year. Sometimes he brought groceries. Sometimes he fixed things around the property just to stay busy. Sometimes we simply sat on the porch in silence while cold wind rolled through the pines. Older people understand silence better than younger ones. Silence doesn't always mean emptiness. Sometimes it means respect. Daniel Mercer became part of my life shortly after the funeral. Victor had trusted him for years. Daniel was in his early 60s, sharp-minded but calm with the kind of patience only older attorneys seem to develop. Not flashy, not theatrical, just careful. The first time we reviewed Victor's estate together, Daniel closed the office door and lowered his voice. Victor believed somebody around him intended to ruin him financially, he said. I looked up immediately. You mean Leonard? Daniel hesitated. Among others. That answer stayed with me. Among others. At first, I assumed Daniel meant greedy business associates. I didn't yet understand how far things actually reached. The first year after Victor's death felt like survival. The second year became education. By the third year, I started uncovering things. Victor had left behind thousands of pages of records. Contracts, property acquisitions, bank transfers, correspondence. Most widows probably would have handed everything to attorneys and walked away. But I remembered something Victor once told me beside the fireplace during a snowstorm. Never ignore paper trails. Greedy people always leave fingerprints somewhere. So I started reading, night after night, sometimes until 2 in the morning. At first I found small irregularities, land purchases that made no sense, payments routed through shell companies, construction bids mysteriously inflated. Then I started noticing familiar names, county officials, developers, Leonard Voss, and eventually, my father. The first time I saw Raymond Carter's name connected to Victor's business files, I honestly thought it had to be a mistake. But there it was. 3 separate payments spread across 18 months after my marriage. Large payments, far larger than gambling debt. My hands shook while holding those papers. Victor had been right. My father hadn't simply accepted money to save the farm. He had stayed connected afterward, somehow involved, somehow benefiting. That realization hollowed something out inside me. Even after everything, part of me still wanted to believe my father had simply been desperate. Not corrupt, not knowingly dangerous, just weak. But weak men can still destroy lives, especially when money enters the room. The next major discovery came from the security archives. Victor had cameras installed across the estate during the final year of his life. Daniel helped me recover old recordings. Most footage was useless. Deliveries, employees, wildlife crossing the property at night. But occasionally, there were conversations. Important conversations. One recording showed Leonard Voss arguing violently with Victor near the garage 3 months before the crash. I still remember Leonard's face turning red while rain hammered the driveway outside. You think you can destroy everybody and walk away clean? Leonard snapped. Victor answered coldly. You already destroyed yourself. Another recording captured something even worse. My father visiting the property without telling me. I nearly stopped breathing when I saw him appear on screen. Victor met him privately near the workshop. The audio wasn't perfect because of wind, but parts remained clear enough. Dad sounded nervous. Victor sounded furious. You took money, Victor said sharply. I needed help, my father muttered. You sold your daughter because you needed help. Dad snapped back defensively. You act like she suffered here. Victor stepped closer. This conversation ends now. Then came the sentence that haunted me afterward. If anything happens to Elena because of your greed, Victor warned I'll bury you financially. The footage ended there. I sat frozen in Daniel's office after watching it. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, Daniel removed his glasses slowly. Elena, he said carefully, Victor suspected financial fraud involving Leonard, several county officials, and possibly your father. I stared at the screen. My father's a farmer. He was a farmer, Daniel corrected quietly. That distinction chilled me more than I expected. By the 4th year, I had changed more than people realized. Back in Ohio, I'd been timid, careful, always waiting for permission before speaking. That woman disappeared somewhere between Victor's funeral and those endless nights reviewing records. I learned how to negotiate contracts, how to manage investments, how to recognize manipulation before it entered a room. Victor had spent years teaching me things my own father never believed I was capable of understanding. And slowly, I stopped feeling afraid. Not because I became hard, because I became prepared. That matters more. Then came the phone call. A local reporter mentioned one of Victor's commercial properties had sold for nearly $12 million. The story spread fast across Colorado. Apparently, it traveled even faster back to Ohio. 3 days later, a black SUV pulled into my driveway just before sunset. I watched from the upstairs window as my family climbed out. Dad first. Older now. Heavier. But still carrying himself with the same false authority. Mom followed more slowly, wrapped in a pale blue coat. She looked tired in a way that hurt me unexpectedly. Dean stepped out last beside his wife Cheryl, already surveying the property like he was pricing furniture. Walter Briggs stood beside me upstairs, watching quietly. Well, he muttered, vultures finally smelled the carcass. Despite everything, I almost laughed. Almost. I met them at the front door. For a moment, nobody spoke. 4 years without contact, suddenly standing on my porch beneath gray Colorado skies. Then my mother started crying. Elena, she whispered. Dad immediately stepped forward. We should talk inside. Not hello. Not how have you been. Straight to business. Some things never change. Still, I smiled politely and opened the door. Of course, I said. What none of them knew was that every room in the house now had active cameras. Daniel Mercer waited upstairs reviewing documents. And Walter Briggs had already contacted the county sheriff earlier that afternoon after I told him my family was coming. Not because we planned revenge, because older people learn something important eventually. When greedy people smell money, they become unpredictable. Dinner felt almost normal at first. That was the unsettling part. Mom complimented the curtains. Dean admired the bourbon collection. Dad wandered through the living room staring at artwork and antique furniture with poorly hidden resentment. Then finally he sat down across from me at the dining table, folded his hands, and said the words I think he'd rehearsed during the entire flight from Ohio. Family deserves to share what family helped build. Behind him, Walter quietly locked the front door. Family deserves to share what family helped build. My father said it calmly, reasonably, like he was discussing weather instead of trying to claim pieces of a dead man's life. The dining room fell quiet after that sentence. Outside, snow drifted slowly past the windows while the grandfather clock near the staircase ticked loud enough to feel irritating. Dean leaned back in his chair and nodded like Dad had finally said the obvious thing everyone else was too polite to mention. Cheryl reached for another dinner roll, and my mother stared at her untouched plate. I looked at my father for several long seconds before answering. What exactly did this family help build? Dad sighed heavily, already sounding exhausted by my resistance. Elena. No, I said softly. I'd really like to know. His jaw tightened. That man wouldn't have looked twice at you if I hadn't arranged the marriage. There it was. Not guilt. Not shame. Ownership. Even after all these years, he still believed my life had been a transaction he deserved commission on. Walter Briggs stood quietly near the kitchen doorway, pretending interest in the coffee pot while hearing every word. Dean pointed his fork toward me. You're acting like Dad didn't save you too. I almost laughed at that. Save me. You lived in luxury for 4 years, Dean said. Most women in Ash Creek would have killed for that life. Killed. Interesting choice of words. Mom flinched slightly when he said it. I noticed. I noticed everything now. Dinner continued with the strange politeness families use when everybody knows something ugly is waiting underneath the table. Dad complimented the wine. Dean talked about rising property taxes back in Ohio. Cheryl asked fake questions about mountain life she clearly didn't care about. Only Mom remained mostly silent. Every now and then I caught her staring at me with something close to regret. Not enough regret to stop any of this, but enough to hurt anyway. Finally, Dad set down his glass. We didn't fly across the country for small talk. There it is, Walter muttered quietly behind him. Dad ignored that completely. He looked directly at me. You inherited a fortune because this family made sacrifices. I stared at him carefully. What sacrifice did you make, Dad? His expression hardened. I did what I had to do. That sentence instantly pulled me backward through time. The farmhouse kitchen in Ohio. Rain hitting windows, his hand slamming against the dinner table. I did what I had to do. Funny how people reuse excuses their entire lives. I stood slowly and carried my wine glass toward the fireplace. Nobody spoke while I moved. The cameras mounted discreetly throughout the room captured every face, every reaction, every lie. You know something strange, I said quietly. Victor used to say funerals reveal people faster than weddings. Dean rolled his eyes. Here we go. I ignored him. At his funeral, I continued, most people talked about grief. I turned toward Dad. But you talked about properties. His face changed slightly then. Not panic yet? Just caution. You were upset, he said carefully. I was observant. Walter crossed his arms. Dean shifted uncomfortably. Mom looked like she wanted to disappear entirely. I set my wine glass down. Victor knew people around him were waiting for him to die. Nobody answered. Even the house felt still. Then Dad scoffed. That old man was paranoid. Yes, I agreed softly. He was. I let the silence stretch another moment. Turns out he had reasons. What? Dean suddenly leaned forward aggressively. Look, let's stop dancing around this. Dad says Victor left you over $30 million after assets cleared. There it was. The real conversation. Not grief. Not reconciliation. Money. Pure and simple. I nodded slowly. And you don't need all of it. Cheryl immediately added, especially with no children. That one hit harder than she intended. Victor and I had tried quietly for 2 years before his health worsened. Nobody at the table knew that except Walter. I saw anger flash briefly across his face. My mother whispered Cheryl, but Cheryl kept going. We're family too. Family. That word sounded almost funny coming from people who hadn't called me once in 4 years. I walked toward the built-in cabinet beside the fireplace and opened a drawer slowly. Dad's eyes followed my hands immediately. Predators always watch movement. Inside the drawer sat a small remote control. Walter finally stepped fully into the room. Dean frowned. What's this supposed to be? I pressed one button. The television mounted above the fireplace flickered alive. Security footage appeared on screen. Black and white. Rain pouring across Victor's driveway. Then Leonard Voss stepped into frame, arguing with Victor near the garage. The room went dead silent. Dad stared at the screen, instantly recognizing the seriousness of what he was seeing. Leonard's voice crackled through speakers. You think you can destroy everybody and walk away clean? Victor answered coldly. You already destroyed yourself. The recording continued another minute before ending. Dean looked confused. What is this? Evidence, I said calmly. Dad's voice lowered carefully. Evidence of what? I met his eyes. That depends how honest everyone wants to be tonight. For the first time since arriving, I saw genuine fear move across my father's face. Small. Quick, but real. I changed the footage. The next recording loaded. Dad immediately went pale, seeing himself appear on screen walking beside Victor near the workshop. Mom covered her mouth softly. Dean stared at the television. What the hell is this? Wind distorted parts of the audio, but Victor's voice came through clearly enough. You sold your daughter because you needed help. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Dad whispered harshly, turn this off. I didn't. The recording continued. If anything happens to Elena because of your greed, Victor warned I'll bury you financially. The video ended. Silence swallowed the room. My father looked older suddenly. Not sympathetic older. Exposed older. Like years of excuses finally collapsed under their own weight. Mom started crying quietly. Dean looked back and forth between us, trying to decide which version of reality to believe. Then Dad slammed his palm against the table. That man manipulated everything. Walter spoke for the first time in several minutes. Careful, Raymond. Dad pointed toward me furiously. She's twisting things. No, I said softly. Victor recorded them exactly as they happened. His breathing turned uneven. That caught my attention immediately. Because fear affects guilty people differently than innocent ones. Innocent people get angry. Guilty people start calculating. Dad's eyes flicked briefly toward the front door. Walter noticed too. So now we're getting somewhere, Walter murmured. I walked back toward the table slowly. You know what bothered me most after Victor died? Nobody answered. It wasn't the money, I continued. It wasn't even the loneliness. I looked directly at Dad. It was realizing the first person who ever protected me was the man everybody called dangerous. Mom began sobbing harder after that. Dean stared at the table. And Dad finally looked uncertain. Not powerful, not commanding, just old and cornered. Then I reached into another drawer and removed a thick manila folder. Daniel Mercer stepped quietly downstairs for the first time all evening. Dad's face completely drained of color, because he recognized Daniel immediately. The attorney placed the folder carefully on the dining table. Inside were copies of bank transfers, land agreements, recorded payments, connections, years of them. Daniel adjusted his glasses calmly. Mr. Carter, he said, before anyone leaves tonight, there are several financial matters law enforcement would like clarified. Dad stood abruptly. I'm leaving. Walter Briggs stepped between him and the hallway. Then, calm as a church pastor delivering Sunday scripture, he said, Sit back down. Sit back down. Walter Briggs didn't raise his voice when he said it. He didn't need to. Some men spend enough years carrying authority that calmness becomes more frightening than shouting. My father froze halfway between the dining chair and the hallway. For a second, nobody moved. The grandfather clock ticked softly in the corner. Snow brushed against the windows, and Dean looked like a man slowly realizing dinner had become something far more dangerous than a family argument. Dad tried forcing a laugh. This is insane. Daniel Mercer remained standing beside the table, hands folded neatly in front of him. No, Daniel said calmly. What's insane is how long certain people believed nobody was paying attention. Dad's eyes darted toward me, toward Walter, toward the front door. Calculating. Always calculating. Then finally he sat back down, slowly, carefully, like a man lowering himself into cold water. Nobody touched their food anymore. The roast sat untouched in the center of the table, while candlelight flickered across faces that suddenly looked much older than they had an hour earlier. My mother kept crying quietly into a napkin. Dean rubbed both hands over his face. Cheryl stared at the manila folder like it might explode. And me? I felt strangely calm. Not triumphant. Not angry. Just finished hiding. That's different. People think revenge feels explosive. In reality, real revenge often feels quiet. Like finally setting down something heavy you've carried too long. Daniel opened the folder carefully. Victor Hale began documenting financial irregularities approximately 18 months before his death, he explained. Dad immediately interrupted. I don't know anything about Victor's business dealings. Daniel slid several papers across the table. Bank transfers. Wire receipts. Property agreements. My father recognized them instantly. I saw it happen in his eyes before he could hide it. These payments, Daniel continued, were routed through agricultural development accounts connected to Leonard Voss. Dad's voice turned defensive. That was consulting work. Walter let out a low grunt. A farmer from Ash Creek suddenly doing six-figure consulting. Dad snapped toward him. You don't know a damn thing about me. Walter didn't blink. I know enough. Daniel continued methodically. That was what made him effective. No drama, no threats. Just facts laid out slowly enough for guilt to suffocate under its own weight. Victor had uncovered a land fraud scheme involving commercial development rights across 3 counties. Leonard Voss and several county officials were inflating property valuations before purchasing surrounding land through shell companies. Victor discovered millions disappearing through falsified contracts. And somewhere along the way, my father became involved. Not as mastermind. Not even close. As something worse in certain ways. Useful. Dad kept shaking his head. I never heard anybody. Nobody answered immediately. Because the problem was, that might have been true. At least directly. But older people eventually learn a painful reality. You don't need to pull the trigger to help evil happen. Sometimes silence does enough damage. Dean finally spoke. Dad, what exactly did you do? The question sounded smaller than I expected. Not angry. Almost frightened. Dad looked at his son helplessly. I needed money. There's always money, Walter muttered. Dad ignored him. The farm was collapsing, he said. The bank was circling us. Your mother was sick. Dean couldn't keep steady work back then. So you sold, Elena, Dean asked quietly. Dad slammed his fist against the table. I saved this family. The room echoed afterward. Mom flinched hard enough to make Cheryl grab her arm. I stared at my father across the candles and finally understood something I should have realized years earlier. He truly believed his own justifications. That's the dangerous thing about selfish people. Eventually they rewrite memory until survival becomes morality. Daniel carefully removed another document. This was found in Victor Hale's private records after his death. Dad visibly stiffened. Daniel looked directly at him. It's a written statement prepared 3 weeks before the accident. My heartbeat slowed immediately. I had never seen this document before. Daniel unfolded the paper carefully. Victor's signature sat clearly at the bottom. Daniel began reading aloud. If harm comes to me unexpectedly, Leonard Voss should be investigated immediately. I also believe Raymond Carter possesses information regarding financial coercion and illegal property acquisitions connected to Voss operations. Mom gasped softly. Dean looked physically sick. Dad whispered, "That's not proof." "No," Daniel agreed calmly, "but this is..." He slid another packet across the table. "Maintenance reports, vehicle inspections, repair records." Walter crossed his arms tighter while Daniel continued. The official accident report concluded Victor's vehicle lost braking power during heavy rain. Dad stared silently. Daniel turned another page. However, an independent mechanical review performed later showed intentional tampering within the brake line assembly. The room went completely still. Even the clock seemed quieter somehow. Cheryl whispered first, "Oh my God." Dean looked directly at Dad. "You knew." Dad's face twisted immediately. "Number." "Too fast. Too sharp." Walter noticed too. "So you already know what he's asking," Walter said quietly. Dad realized his mistake a second too late. "Fo?" My mother finally broke. "I told you this would happen," she sobbed suddenly. Everyone turned toward her. Years of silence cracked open all at once. "You should have left it alone," she cried at Dad. "You should have walked away after the wedding." Dad stared at her in disbelief. "Margaret." "No," she shouted louder than I'd heard in years. Tears streamed down her face. "You kept taking money. You kept answering Leonard's calls. You kept saying one more deal would fix everything." Dean whispered, "Mom." She looked toward me then, and what I saw in her face nearly broke my heart. Not innocence. Cowardice. "There's a difference. I wanted to call you so many times," she whispered. "But your father said Victor would cut us off forever." I laughed softly before I could stop myself. Not because it was funny. Because after all these years, that was still the excuse. Fear. Always fear. Fear of losing comfort. Fear of losing money. Fear of angering powerful men. People destroy families every day trying to avoid discomfort. Dad suddenly stood again. But this time the fight had drained out of him. He looked exhausted. Older than I'd ever seen him. "I never touched those brakes," he said quietly. Nobody argued, because deep down, I believed him. Dad wasn't brave enough for murder. But bravery isn't required for complicity. I didn't think Leonard would actually... His voice cracked slightly. "I thought Victor would settle financially and walk away." Walter's expression hardened. And when he died, Dad sat heavily back into the chair. I told myself it was coincidence. Silence again. Long. Heavy. Then Walter finally spoke. "You know what separates decent men from cowards, Raymond?" Dad didn't answer. Decent men tell the truth before funerals. About 30 minutes later, county deputies arrived quietly at the house. Not dramatic, no handcuffs, no shouting. Just questions waiting to begin. Dad cooperated immediately once he realized the evidence already existed. Dean sat motionless staring at the floor while Cheryl silently cried beside him. Mom looked completely shattered. Before deputies escorted Dad outside for formal questioning, he paused beside the dining table and looked at me. For the first time in my life, he looked ashamed. Not defensive, not proud. Ashamed. "Elena," he said weakly, "I did love you." I held his gaze steadily. "You loved surviving more." He lowered his head after that. And somehow, that hurt worse than if he'd argued. Later that night, after everyone finally left, the house became quiet again. Walter poured 2 cups of coffee while snow covered the driveway outside. Daniel gathered paperwork silently upstairs. I stood alone near the darkened window looking at Victor's reflection in old memories more than glass. Walter handed me a mug gently. "You all right?" I thought about the question, honestly. Then answered the only way I could. "I think tonight was the first time I stopped being afraid of them." Walter nodded slowly. "That's usually when healing starts." The first time I visited my father after the investigation, he looked 20 years older. Not because of prison. He never went to prison. Age handled the punishment before the courts fully could. By the time winter settled over Ohio again, Raymond Carter had already lost most of what mattered to him. The farm was gone. The debt investigations destroyed what remained of his finances. Several county officials accepted plea deals and testified against Leonard Voss, whose fraud operation collapsed publicly within months. Voss himself died before trial from a stroke at a private rehabilitation facility in Arizona. Walter said men like Leonard rarely survive once their money stops protecting them. Maybe he was right. As for my father, the courts determined he had knowingly participated in fraudulent financial arrangements tied to Voss, though investigators found no evidence directly linking him to Victor's murder. Cowardice, not violence. That was Raymond Carter's true crime. He saw danger coming and chose silence because he thought money might save him. In the end, it ruined him anyway. There's probably a lesson in that. After the deputies questioned him in Colorado, Dad returned to Ohio under legal supervision, while attorneys sorted through months of investigations. We barely spoke during that time. Honestly, I preferred it. Some wounds need distance before they can heal cleanly. Mom called occasionally. Short conversations mostly. Careful ones. She sounded tired now in a way I recognized immediately. People who spend decades trapped beside controlling men eventually begin shrinking emotionally. By the time freedom arrives, many barely know what to do with it. One afternoon in early spring, she admitted something quietly over the phone. I should have taken you and left years ago. I stood in Victor's kitchen holding the receiver while snow melted slowly outside the windows. Yes, I answered honestly. Silence followed. Then soft crying. Older people understand something. Younger people often resist. Sometimes the truth hurts less than pretending. The newspapers eventually picked up the full story. Not nationally. Just regional coverage. Colorado fraud investigations. Suspicious financial networks. Questions surrounding Victor Hale's death. For the first time in decades, people publicly reconsidered who Victor had actually been. That mattered to me more than the inheritance ever did. Because the truth was simple. Victor Hale had not been a saint. But he had been decent. Lonely. Guarded. Difficult sometimes. But decent. And in the end, the man everyone feared became the only person who ever truly protected me. Life has strange humor like that. Oh, about 6 months after the investigation closed, Walter Briggs drove me to the old cemetery outside Cedar Ridge where Victor was buried. The mountains stood quiet beneath pale autumn clouds. Walter walked slower these days, age finally catching up to him. Still stubborn, though. Still refusing help carrying anything heavier than groceries. We stood beside Victor's grave while cold wind stirred fallen leaves around our shoes. Walter adjusted his coat collar. You know, he muttered, Victor would have hated all this attention. I smiled softly. I know. He liked privacy more than breathing. That too. Walter looked toward the mountains a while before speaking again. You gave your father mercy he probably didn't deserve. I thought carefully about that. Maybe he was right. When prosecutors asked whether I wanted harsher financial charges pursued against Dad personally, I cooperated honestly, but declined to push aggressively for maximum penalties. Some people called me foolish afterward. Maybe they were right too. But revenge changes shape eventually. At first you want suffering. Then later, if you're lucky, you simply want peace. I didn't spare him because he earned it, I finally told Walter. Walter glanced sideways at me. Why then? Because I was tired of becoming smaller every time I hated him. Walter nodded slowly. Older men appreciate honest answers. That winter I flew back to Ohio for the first time in nearly 5 years. Ash Creek looked smaller than I remembered. Funny how childhood towns shrink once fear stops magnifying them. The old Carter farm had already been sold to a commercial agriculture company. Seeing strangers' equipment parked beside the barn should have hurt more than it did. Instead, I mostly felt tired. My father now rented a small single-story house outside town near the highway. Nothing fancy, nothing impressive. Just a quiet little place with peeling paint and a sagging porch swing. Mom opened the door when I arrived. For a moment we simply stared at each other. Then she hugged me. Not dramatically. Not like movies. Just tightly. Like someone finally letting themselves grieve properly. Dad sat at the kitchen table when I walked in. The sight shocked me more than I expected. He looked frail. Smaller. His shoulders curved inward now instead of outward. Pride had finally stopped holding his spine together. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then he quietly said, "You came." I sat across from him slowly. "You asked." The kitchen smelled faintly like coffee and old wood polish, almost identical to the farmhouse years ago, except now everything felt quieter, safer somehow. Dad stared down at his hands. I used to think survival justified everything he admitted. I listened silently. When I was younger, my father lost work during the steel layoffs. We nearly lost everything. He swallowed hard. I promised myself my family would never feel that helpless again. I understood that fear. Many Americans his age did. Factories closed. Farms disappeared. Men raised to believe providing defined their worth suddenly found themselves terrified. Fear changes people, sometimes into protectors, sometimes into cowards. I kept telling myself I was saving us, he whispered. I looked at him carefully. And when did saving us become selling me? That question broke something in him finally. Dad covered his eyes briefly. No excuses this time. No anger. Just shame. I don't know, he admitted softly. And somehow, that honesty mattered. Not enough to erase the past. Nothing could. But enough to stop carrying all that poison alone. Before leaving Ohio, I visited the old church cemetery where my grandparents were buried. Small towns bury generations close together. Maybe that's why old communities remember both kindness and cruelty so long. On the flight back to Colorado, I kept thinking about Victor. About Walter. About the strange road my life had taken because one lonely man saw value in me before I saw it myself. A month later, I established the Hale Foundation using part of Victor's estate. Nothing flashy. Scholarships for rural students. Legal support for widows facing property disputes. Emergency housing assistance for women escaping abusive situations. Quiet things. Useful things. Victor would have approved of that, probably while pretending not to. The final time I visited Victor's grave, spring sunlight covered the mountains behind the cemetery. I placed fresh flowers beside the headstone and stood there a while listening to wind move through pine trees. Then I said the words I should have spoken years earlier. You were the first person who taught me my life belonged to me. And for the first time in a very long while, the silence afterward felt peaceful. If this story meant something to you, maybe take a moment tonight to think about the people who protected your dignity when life became difficult, and the moments when fear almost turned good people into strangers. And if you've ever had to rebuild yourself after betrayal, know this. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do isn't revenge. Sometimes it's refusing to let bitterness become your final inheritance. Thank you for spending this time with me.